December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours, Hansfeld, Belgium. The night hadn't lifted yet. The trees were silhouettes, the ground a plate of iron under a thin frost. A Tiger's engine tried to catch. One cough, a shudder, then silence. SS Obashto Banura. Jochen Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch. The crash of metal ricocheted through the dark and died just as quickly. Down in the bowels of the machine, Unschar Viber twisted the starter again. Nothing. The needle on the gauge mocked them. Empty. Herr Oberanura, Weber's voice crawled up through the compartment, tight and thin. The reserve? Dry. Peiper climbed down into the brittle cold, boots cracking the frozen Belgian soil. All around him lay the spear he'd been handed for, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes gamble. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, close to 5,000 of the Waffen-SS's best. None of that mattered with empty fuel tanks. It was a steel army with a starving heart. Through the mist he could make out the edges of Hansfeld, an American position the enemy had just abandoned. The place smelled like ash and hot coffee. Embers glowed in oil drums. Cups still steamed on upturned crates. And everywhere, standing in disciplined rows like a final, taunting formation, were jerry cans. Olive drab by the thousands. A gift that did not feel like mercy. He approached slowly. Adjutant Halpedum Führer Hans Gruller banged a lid loose, took a cautious sniff, and lifted his eyebrows. Benzine, Herr Oaschanführer, high-octane gasoline. Men moved like sprinters off the blocks, cracking caps, sloshing liquid gold into German machines. Peiper walked the lines, counting. The arithmetic crushed his chest. 50,000 gallons, enough on paper to push his entire Kammgruppe to the Meuse River. Enough to alter a battle, enough, if you ignored everything else, to pretend a war could pivot on a lucky find. He didn't ignore everything else. Standing amid the bounty, watching his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a thought settled on him, the way fog settles into low fields and doesn't move for days. If they could abandon this much, if they could walk away from what his country guarded with entire divisions, then the war's verdict had already been written. Germany hadn't simply misjudged an opponent. It had misread the whole shape of modern war. Half a year before, this morning, at Hansfeld, June 1944, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, had placed a report on the Führer's desk that should have frozen offensive dreams where they stood. Synthetic production, the Wehrmacht's lifeblood, was being broken apart methodically. The Leuna works that had turned out 175,000 tons in April sputtered to 5,000 by September. Hydrogenation plants at Pitts, Blehammer, and Brooks were shadows of themselves, running at less than 10%. Numbers don't bluff. The United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil in 1944. Germany, counting everything, synthetic output, captured Romanian wells, managed 33 million, less than 2% of what America produced. Mechanized war yoked to horse-drawn logistics. That's what the Third Reich was really fielding, even as America soaked whole armies in fuel. Major Friedrich Simon in the Wehrmacht's logistics command had run his own cold math. The Ardennes offensive needed 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler earmarked 5 million. Half actually made it through. Rails bombed, roads choked. What was allocated on a map never fully arrived at the front. The plan was explicit about its true hope: capture the enemy's supplies. It sounded daring. It was desperation dressed in boldness. Across the lines, Americans were building a petroleum nervous system that pulsed day and night. PLU, pipeline under the ocean, pushed fuel beneath the channel. The Red Ball Express, thousands of trucks grinding along color-coded routes, threw 12,500 tons forward every single day. By December 1944, the American war machine in Europe drank 1.2 million gallons daily and received 1.4 million. They were fighting and adding to reserves at the same time. Peiper wasn't naive. At 29, a regimental commander in the Waffen-SS, Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, bled in on the Eastern Front. He knew fuel outweighed bullets in the ledger of modern battle. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive hammer of the offensive. On December 14th at Tondorf, General Sepp Dietrich, 6th SS Panzer Army, had been blunt. You can reach the Meuse if you capture American fuel. The allocation for Camp Grouper Peiper, 31,000 gallons. Roughly 50 miles of combat movement. The Meuse sat 65 miles away. The math of failure was quietly welded into the plan from the start. So, he laid down strictures. Single-file tank movement to cut drag and conserve. Kill engines for halts longer than 5 minutes. Make American fuel dumps priority 1. Above maps, above trophies, above any target that didn't burn or pour. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion scribbled in a diary on December 16th. Fuel resupply, 8,000 G. Third delivery this week, storage tanks already at capacity. It's possible to hate a sentence. December 16th, 1944. 0530 hours. The curtain-raising barrage shook the trees and grounded men. In 2 hours, the guns burned through more ammunition than some earlier operations had received in total. It looked like abundance. It was momentum borrowed against a dwindling account. Peiper's column got moving around Zoo 700, already late. The roads that a map sold as highways turned out to be country lanes, sometimes no more than dirt ribbons. Vehicles bred for the Russian steppes groaned and slipped through the Ardennes woods. Traffic turned into a living thing with moods, bottlenecks, snarls, stalling fits. At Lanzarote, a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men, sat down in the middle of history and refused to move. They held back an armored fist for nearly 10 hours. That delay was paid in fuel as idling engines sipped and then gulped at reserves. At dawn on December 17th, they rolled into Hansfeld, 20 miles behind them, 40% of their fuel gone. The halfway mark to the MOS was still ahead and already looked like a mirage. Hansfeld wasn't even a jewel box on an American logistics chart. It was what the U.S. classified as a Class 3B depot, a forward pump station. Yet what they found there beat a Panzer Division's monthly allocation. Helmführer Hans Grueller would remember it cleanly. Pyramids of jerry cans, 5 gallons each, stacked 3 meters high, running 200 meters. Untouched, not spiked, not set alight. And the contents, aviation-grade high-octane cut with motor fuel of 80 or better, were so rich some German vehicles coughed on it. Tiger Maybachs had been designed for 74. Too good could be its own problem. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman pawed through a depot office and found shipping manifests. He read English, courtesy of his father's import shop. The papers told a story as vast as any campaign. Texas to New York to Liverpool to Normandy to Hansfeld. Over 6,000 miles, less than 6 weeks. He showed them to Oceanbahn-Führer Peiper. It too reads, then a crush of paper and a gloved fist and a face gone bloodless. The problem wasn't supply lines. It was the scale of the world on the other side. Private Ernst Kara flipped open a copy of Stars and Stripes, December 15th. The headline smiled about a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, 300,000 gallons per day. One pipe beating in more fuel than Camp Gripper Peiper would use for the entire push. Compare that to Germany's condition by late 1944. Synthetic output down 90% since May. The Luftwaffe grounding aircraft for want of aviation fuel. Pilot training cut from 250 hours to 60. The surface fleet in harbor. U-boat nursing batteries with snorkels. Private cars gone since 1942. The Gestapo chasing thieves for single liters. Farmers back behind horses. In the same year, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. East Texas alone outpumped all of German-occupied Europe. Refineries were running so hot that Standard Oil fiddled with byproducts just to use up extra crude. That's not wealth, that's tidewater. Fueled with the 50,000 gallons from Hansfeld, the column surged. Billingen fell by noon on December 17th. More captures, rations, ammunition, and maps pointing to other American depots. The maps didn't whisper hope. They shouted the same conclusion. The Americans had stockpiles everywhere. Crossroads, depot, rail spurs, depot. The U.S. First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper's men pushed to Lineville. There, the Malmedy massacre would stain the record. 84 American prisoners dead. Even that atrocity was tied to the same ache. Peiper later said he couldn't burn gasoline transporting POWs. By evening, the spear reached Stavelot, a major American fuel depot holding over 2 million gallons. Here was the hinge: enough fuel to guarantee a dash to the Meuse. But the Americans weren't waiting around to be robbed. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had gotten the warning. His orders were ice: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The numbers on the ground were obscene: 289,000 gallons across 15 acres. At 16:30 on December 17th, as the German nose of advance showed itself, Brewster gave the word. Gasoline trails were poured like writing. White phosphorus grenades handed out like pens. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis pulled the pin on the first sentence. The response was immediate and biblical. A wall of flame stood up and shouted to the sky. When the lead tanks rolled up, they stared into a black column reaching 1,000 feet, a monument built entirely of American fuel and American decision. It burned for 3 days, long enough to power Peiper's division to Antwerp and back, now turned to heat and smoke just to ensure German hands never felt it. Unterführer Weber remembered the Oberschirm Führer on the turret rim, a statue cut from thought. 5 minutes without words. Then, they can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here? That scene repeated across the Ardennes. Tuapon, 1.1 million gallons burned. Spar, 2.5 million gone. In the first week, Americans torched over 8 million gallons to keep it from capture, more than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. You don't fight an army that does that with courage. You fight it with factories. Or you don't fight it at all. Behind those bonfires stood a machine that felt more like a country than a plan. The Red Ball Express had already pushed 412,000 tons forward with 6,000 trucks, 24 hours a day. Each truck ate 40 gallons daily. The delivery system itself consumed more fuel than Army Group B received in a month. By December, the motor transport service ran 230 truck companies on routes coded like a subway map. 20,000 tons moved daily, 3,000 of that fuel. Colonel James Snyder, 1st Army Logistics, wrote on December 18th, "Fuel receipts yesterday 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued 1,623,000 gall. Net gain to reserves 224,000 gall. War as ledger, and the side that keeps saving while spending. Pipelines made trucks look small. Operation PLUTO pumped 1 million gallons a day from Britain. Inland, the Cherbourg-Paris line carried 800,000 daily. The Seine line, 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe burned 7.5 million gallons each day and received about 8.22 million gallons. They were building a cushion while attacking. On December 18th, Peiper's formations clawed forward to Schauer, grabbed another depot, and watched the fresh fuel atomize in combat. Tigers gulped about 2.5 gallons per mile in battle, Panthers around 1.5. In the hills and snow of the Ardennes, those figures rose by 40%. Helped Otto Dingler, maintenance for 1st SS Panzer, scribbled a cold tally. By noon, 67,000 gallons burned since kickoff, maybe 55,000 captured. They were operating at a deficit while trying to run a race. American ears listening through ultra-intercepts caught the need behind German radio traffic. General Courtney Hodges issued his own blunt order: enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. On that same day, C-47s flew 316 sorties to Bastonia, dropped supplies that included 160,000 gallons of fuel. A surrounded garrison in the snow received by air more gasoline than Peiper's entire Kammgruppe possessed. Sometimes arithmetic looks like magic when you're on the ground. By December 19th, around Stoumont, the crisis sharpened to a point. Tanks didn't die from hits. They died from thirst. Crews stepped out of intact machines and left them by the road. Peiper pooled what he had left, maybe 8,000 gallons, enough to fight once or to flee once, but not both. Elsewhere, planners were already sketching January. Brigadier General Morris Gilland asked for 245 million gallons. Approved without a shrug. The contrast wasn't only about quantity. It was about design. Sherman tanks around 0.8 gallons per mile, Tigers at 2.5. American trucks did 8 miles per gallon when full. Parts matched, maintenance routines were standard, a chorus singing from the same sheet. German units fielded whatever they could capture or build. French hulls, Soviet trucks, German Opels, each with its own appetite and ailments. Every bolt that didn't fit multiplied the problem. December 20th brought a final cruelty by radio. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Peiper gathered his subordinates. Sternbannführer Vera Pertka didn't waste air. Enough for 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. H. Timura Gruler remembered the Oberschem Bannführer's verdict. We are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them. We cannot win. Others felt the same cold hand on their necks. General Hasso von Manteuffel, 5th Panzer, wrote later that when he learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, he knew the offensive had failed before it began. Colonel Friedrich von Dunder, captured on December 23rd, told interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st at Lays, Peiper was pocketed, tanks inert. Opposing them, the 31st Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, 3rd Armored, carried a shared allocation of 340,000 gallons for that day alone. Peiper's tally hovered at roughly 1,000. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home that they had Germans surrounded who ran out of gas, and that their captain joked they used more fuel heating coffee than the enemy had for tanks. You can't shoot a joke, but it can wound. Patton's Third Army pivoted north in a move German officers labeled impossible. It took 350,000 gallons to redeploy. It took 3 days to do it. On December 23rd, the sky opened and Allied aircraft poured in. 2,000 sorties, P-47s burning 300 gallons per hour, B-26s around 200. 1 day of flying ate more fuel than Germany had set aside for the entire Ardennes effort. The night of December 23rd into the 24th, Peiper ordered the thing you never dream you'll order: abandon vehicles and get out on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that started, 39 were still mechanically sound but couldn't move. Crews destroyed them with what ammunition remained. Oberreiter Heinz Goals remembered the bitter comedy of siphoning, draining the last drops from all machines, maybe 200 gallons total, a puddle under a sky full of smoke. The Obstand Führer put a charge to his own command tank. Of the roughly 5,000 who rolled in with KF Grouper Peiper, about 770 got out. They'd gone 60 miles, snatched depots, and learned something truer than any order. Logistics is a verdict, not an argument. Word of what Peiper had seen traveled upward. December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model read the reports of captured American stocks. He checked the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed in the opening week. His comment, "We are not fighting the same war," wasn't poetry. It was diagnosis. On December 28th, Hitler refused to swallow the numbers. Speer would later write that he called the figures propaganda and waved off photographs of Stavelot's fire as staged. Reality didn't ask him for permission. Greyer Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife that Americans destroyed more fuel daily than they received monthly, that U.S. tanks drove where German soldiers marched. The contradiction tore at the story the regime had told its people. If the decadent enemy could set oceans alight to deny a tactical advantage, what did that say about mastery? The larger frame dwarfed even the fuel lines. By 1944, America built about half of the world's manufactured goods: an aircraft every few minutes, a ship nearly every day, a tank every 7 minutes, numbers that sound like mistakes until you check them against what arrived. Petroleum dwarfed all. United States 1.8 billion barrels, Soviet Union 110 million, Germany 33 million, Japan 2.6 million. The Axis combined couldn't reach 2% of American petroleum output. Every German plan after 1942 carried the same subtext. Do we have the fuel? Every American plan asked a different question. Where do we want to go? Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a moment on December 27th that reads like a parable. Weather curtailed deliveries to only 500,000 gallons per day. Furrowed brows, until someone pointed out that this still exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation. German prisoners from the Ardennes weren't shattered first by artillery. They were stunned by waste they couldn't conceive. Seeing half-eaten rations tossed, gasoline used for warmth, artillery fired in holiday volleys, those things pierced morale deeper than steel. Ausgar Reichelm told interrogators, "We knew your production in the abstract, but seeing your soldiers throw away more than we possessed made it real." Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote home, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." The shock of abundance undercut propaganda at its roots. How could a nation taught to believe in its racial superiority grapple with an enemy whose everyday waste looked like sorcery? At Nuremberg, generals who had lived through maps and mud kept coming back to the same axis: logistics, and within that, fuel. Field Marshal Keitel said that where Germany enjoyed operational superiority in 1940-41, by 1944, they couldn't move while Americans shifted armies like game pieces. Peiper, on trial for the Malmedy massacre, did not try to romanticize maneuver. Every decision after December 17th, he said, bent around fuel. No fuel, no pursuit. No fuel, no withdrawal. Americans moved while they counted leaders. General Heinz Guderian summed it with a brutal simplicity. When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, which meant everything to him but nothing to Americans, the war was over. The lesson that cracks nerves is this: modern war is a spreadsheet in a factory's office as much as it is a map on a general's table. Dr. Richard Overy's ratios for 1944, 5-1 in major production categories, approaching 50-1 in petroleum, are not margins you offset with elan. America produced 324,150 aircraft. Germany, 119,057. American tanks, 80,410. Germany, 46,657. But the bluntest figure never left the pipeline. 1.8 billion barrels to 33 million. That's not a contest. It's gravity. December 24th, 1944. As Peiper's men slipped out on foot, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the truth hardened like winter mud. 50,000 gallons had felt like winning a lottery in the morning. By night, after Stavelot's pillar, it felt like a bad joke. The fuel they fought for was less than one U.S. armored division used in 2 days. The Red Ball Express burned more in 3 hours. Major General J. Lorton Collins would later write that German attempts to seize fuel revealed a misread of American logic. They assumed we prize fuel the way they did, like jewels. They didn't understand we had enough to set it on fire, rather than let it become a lever against us. Operation Watch on the Rhine was defeated by arithmetic as much as by men. The offensive consumed around 2.8 million gallons, roughly 40% from what was supposed to be captured. In the same period, Americans drank 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times as much. The Wehrmacht bled 100,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. The deadliest wound came to belief. Jim Peiper survived the war, carried the stain of Malmedy, sat in prison until 1956. On July 14, 1976, unknown assailants murdered him in France. In 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman something you'd expect from a man who'd seen a depot turn into a prophecy. Finding that depot was the worst thing. If we'd run out earlier, we might have retreated with dignity. Instead, we discovered Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility. What echoes forward is simple enough to be uncomfortable. Logistics beats talent, production smothers bravery, abundance crushes dedication. The average German soldier in 1944 could be better trained and more experienced. It didn't move the needle against an industrial engine that could afford to waste more than the enemy could produce. Every jerry can at Hansfeld, every gallon fried at Stavelot, every pipeline humming under French fields encoded the same truth. Industrial powers don't win because they never make mistakes. They win because they can pay for them. Colonel Trevor Dupy calculated that in December 1944, Each American soldier stood on 67 of supplies daily. Each German, $3. Americans grumbled about waste. Germans would have called it impossible. 40 years later at Lays, veterans gathered beneath a sky that didn't care anymore. The museum's tiger still sits where it died, December 23, 1944, its fuel gauge frozen on empty. Former Unreitzia Karl Wortmann stood next to it with Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. "Why did you stop?" Anderson asked. "We assumed it was a feint." Wortmann laughed in a way that wasn't laughter. "We stopped because tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson hesitated, then said the line that lives in memory because it is both apology and confession. "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it. Archives don't do poetry, but sometimes they come close. Army Group B's war diary reads like a mechanical heart-losing rhythm. December 16th, offensive begins. Fuel, 70% of minimum. December 17th, Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th, multiple depots destroyed, 5+ million gallons lost. December the 19th, fuel critical, units immobilized. December 24th, Peiper abandons vehicles, fuel exhaustion. First Army's numbers on the other side play like a mirror with different physics. December 16th, reserves 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million destroyed. December 18th, 1.8 million received. December 24th, reserves 4.1 million. One side counts gallons, the other counts in millions. Even the chemistry tilted the field. American refineries had mastered catalytic cracking, pushing octane upward with frightening efficiency. American 100-octane aviation gasoline gave its pilots edges that add up over thousands of sorties, while German engines designed for lower-grade synthetics sometimes choked on captured high octane. Additives, tetrathyled, ethylene, diramide detergents, were a quiet edge written into metal and flame. Fuel touched everything. Gerrit Hans Müller wrote on December 20th that his unit marched 30 kilometers while passing American vehicles idling for warmth. Engines running, men walking in snow. Hospitals with skilled surgeons and captured medical stock couldn't move the wounded for lack of gasoline. Oberarch Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting would say it without drama. Men died who could have been saved with a 10-kilometer ride. Stories like that move faster than sensors. Goebbels' diary noted morale cracks as soldiers wrote home about the enemy's superiority, material, not moral. The myth of German excellence didn't survive contact with American logistics. After the Ardennes failure, options narrowed to the edge of a blade. General Jodl testified that after that gamble, they knew it was over. The last card played, the enemy holding all aces. Allied bombs focused even tighter on what still dripped from German plants. By February 1945, production gave out. The Luftwaffe went quiet, training stopped, the Wehrmacht turned static, eaten in place by enemies who could move. Spring brought surreal scenes. Entire Panzer divisions, crews trained and ready, sat beside machines with no future. General Major Fritz Bohlin described having 42 tanks, ammunition, experience, and about 300 leaders. Not enough to make the next town. They blew their own vehicles and walked. Meanwhile, Third Army clogged roads with 15,000 vehicles. Not a parade, just Tuesday. If you want a single line that explains more than footnotes ever will, try this salvage report at Lays. 39 abandoned German tanks in perfect condition, left solely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison wrote that they needed 8,000 gallons to recover them. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time, 4 hours. What Germans could not scrape together to save their best, Americans could pull from a nearby tank farm and have the job done before dinner. That is the Gulf. That is Hansfeld's lesson. So, go back to that morning, December 17th, 1944. Before the flames turned night into day at Stavelot, before orders overrode hope. Picture Peiper's boots crunching frost, the shock of coffee still hot on abandoned cups, the endless rows of American cans. See him counting, mind leaping to the Meuse and to Antwerp and to the idea of changing the course of an offensive. See the thought arrive, slow, heavy, and permanent, that if your enemy can leave this much behind, you are not in the same war. He had found treasure that proved poverty. He had discovered, in the middle of a forward depot, that his war was already over. 50,000 gallons, a number that feels big until you set it next to 7.5 million consumed daily, to 8.22 million delivered, to 289,000 set ablaze, to 8 million burned in a week just to deny it to you. The Battle of the Bulge would kill 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans, break the Wehrmacht's last reserves, and leave behind a different kind of ruin. Belief shattered by arithmetic. December 23rd, Peiper walked away from steel he couldn't feed. December 24th, the tiger that sits in Leglaz's museum marked the end not of a tank, but of an illusion. Visitors ask why such a weapon was abandoned. The answer is short enough to fit on a placard and heavy enough to hold a century. No fuel. And if there's a postscript worth carrying into any future that pretends courage is enough, it's this. Wars between industrial powers are settled by refineries as surely as by rifles. Pipelines might look dull on a map, but they are the veins of victory. In December 1944, one army measured life by the can, the other burned oceans. The outcome was not dramatic, not romantic, and not close. It was inevitable.